A group of reporters was trying to film and interview the protagonist while the weather outside was good. The hunter Junwoo Kim was asked how he felt about becoming the first SSS-ranked hunter in the world. He had become the #1 hunter in less than a year and had risen to the top of the global rankings, which sparked great public interest. They had also learned that the protagonist had received an offer from the Hunter Association. The bright light coming from the portal spread across the audience along with the reporters and other hunters. Junwoo Kim was asked what advice he would give to younger hunters. The dark-haired protagonist walked forward without revealing his face beneath his long bangs. An operation like this hadn't happened in a long time, and he didn't remember telling anyone about it. The excited reporters moved their microphones closer to the night's main star. They asked several questions about hunter selection and various relationships, but he wasn't very interested in that. He understood this was an opportunity they couldn't miss. The protagonist gave a stern look at the paparazzi, saying he didn't have time and was focused only on the raid at that moment. The reporters immediately lowered their eyes, slightly disappointed, as that was the answer they had expected. The protagonist slightly parted his lips, lost in thought. He understood that his appearance in the media was a real gift for the reporters and thought of something that could still please them that night. Junwoo Kim was surrounded by his teammates in front of the portal and declared threateningly to the reporters that he had news he had no doubts about. The protagonist furrowed his brow and slightly bared his teeth. He explained that his team always prioritized the safety of residents above all else, and that this would remain unchanged. The caped young man was about to leave while the reporters watched him in shock. The leader of the hunters explained that it was time to go. The reporters thought the #1 hunter was somehow different from the others. They knew he was someone they could talk to and considered him the best hunter, despite his coldness. He knew that this sentence would be enough to maintain his positive image for a while. Junwoo Kim was a bit stunned when he heard a question from a reporter behind him. He turned to the hunter and asked what he could say to the public about the attack on the cleanup crew. He immediately turned to the reporters with a furious look. He saw a grim image in his mind, staring bloodthirstily at the injured man. The reporter noted that he was talking about an attack on one of the cleanup crew members, adding that he had thrown the man against a wall. The protagonist looked back at the reporters, shocked, trying to figure out which of them knew such news. The dark-haired young man in a jacket blinked sarcastically, surrounded by paparazzi. He replied ironically that he understood Junwoo Kim was going to pretend he didn't know anything, but that he had heard something. He added that the man beaten by the hunter was an acquaintance of his. The young man in the red jacket bared his teeth sarcastically. He said that after all, the #1 hunter was simply magnificent. The same young man looked maliciously at the protagonist, peeking out from under his bangs. He pointed out that Junwoo Kim had beaten a man old enough to be his father and didn't write about it anywhere. As the protagonist looked at the crowd, the reporters began to excitedly discuss the news they had just heard. The main character stared at the young man, deep in thought. He immediately turned and was about to leave the crowd toward the portal, adding that the news was just rumors. The young man shouted behind the protagonist that, in any case, he wished him good luck, calling him the #1 hunter in the world. The hunters, stunned, followed their leader, who looked very angry. They were transported to the Korean Association for the Management of Supernatural Dimensions. It consisted of 2 tall buildings connected to each other. This was the association, an organization to protect the state and citizens from dungeons and monsters. A crowd of civilians ran in fear of the bloodthirsty monsters. This association gathered people with unusual abilities and was divided into 4 teams. A group of people in suits sat at a table discussing news about monsters. Among them was a task force that conducted practical raids and, in simple terms, were called hunters. A boot stepped on the head of a dead monster. Among the hunters, the first task force was considered the most elite team. The protagonist walked with a furrowed brow across the battlefield amidst clouds of dust. There was a 100% success rate in clearing dungeons, and the team members were high-ranking hunters. Junwoo walked ahead with his head down under a cloudy sky. He was the leader of this team. The protagonist picked up his phone and saw a post with his picture. A flood of questions and comments on the weekly news started pouring in. There were angry comments about the recent conference, where the unfortunate news about the assault had come up. The video of his expose had been published on the streaming platform. There were also many comments from people disappointed in him. They claimed he had abused his power. The hunter looked at the phone and became furious, baring his teeth. A brown-haired woman sitting next to him noticed that Junwoo was very upset about the news about him. She asked what had happened to him, since the raid had been a success. He replied sarcastically that she could have guessed on her own since he had asked that no one find out about that news. The girl was driving while the protagonist sat behind her, getting increasingly furious. She said yes, and he immediately began shouting about the information leak, because now the news was on the internet and causing a stir. Their black car was driving down a busy highway. The hunter didn't understand where that reporter had come from, thinking about the various weekly news outlets. The brunette replied that the young man wasn't a reporter, but an ordinary citizen. The protagonist frowned, looking ahead through his bangs. He didn't understand how that was possible, as an ordinary person couldn't have known about that incident. The brunette remembered the image of the young man, next to whom was also his father. She explained that the young man was the son of the very man he had beaten. He was the son of the leader of the dungeon cleanup crew. The hunter was outraged and held his head in frustration over the situation. The driver added that the problem wasn't just that news. The girl raised her eyebrows and cautiously looked away. She noted that several testimonies about past incidents were now surfacing in society, and that the situation would likely only get worse. She thought Junwoo should rest at home for now, considering all this news, since he didn't have any plans at the moment and said it would be a short vacation. The hunter bared his teeth, looking ahead with a bloodthirsty expression. He turned to a girl named Lee, who was their director. He said he hated more than anything people who got in his way. The protagonist looked at the director, who was driving calmly. She commented that she knew that very well. He immediately replied that in that case, she should fix the problem quickly, because if this continued, it would be the end of his reputation. Lee looked in the rearview mirror and saw the furious hunter. She replied that she would try to solve the problem. Junwoo sighed and closed his eyes, saying he was talking to a robot. He decided to change the subject and asked what the association president had said. They were sitting in opposite corners of the car. Lee was driving on the left, and he was on the right in the back seat. She replied that there was nothing special to say, as he planned to hire foreign hunters and was probably waiting for the situation to calm down a bit. The protagonist found that funny, because the president hadn't said anything, simply because he didn't want to deal with him. He wondered if the president would stop communicating with him entirely. The protagonist imagined himself with his back turned to the president. He smiled disdainfully at the thought that he had made a lot of money for him, and if the old man kept acting that way, he wouldn't tolerate it either. The brunette held the steering wheel while Junwoo crossed his arms in offense. She asked again about that moment, and he immediately replied that she sounded like a robot. The hunter furrowed his brow, looking ahead. Lee replied that nothing terrible would happen because, despite public opinion, his ranking would remain unchanged. He understood that this was natural. Junwoo was in the car with his arms crossed. After seeing all that after the raid, he was so angry he was trembling. He remembered punching the pipe in rage while his teammates discussed the news with concern. He wasn't going to let it go. He wanted to find that reporter, but the team members stopped him as they forced him into the car and sent him to the association. He punched the wall in anger. He had calmed down a bit, but his anger hadn't completely disappeared. He remembered himself on the red carpet with a crowd of excited fans in the background. They shouted that he was their savior and the best hunter. He was the youngest hunter in the country, the first S in the SS category, #1 in any ranking. He had also received an offer from the International Hunter Association. He had achieved in an instant what usually took years. He was very angry and looked ahead with a bloodthirsty gaze, baring his teeth. It would be strange if he weren't angry about the situation. He raised his lip and continued to smile threateningly. He didn't understand how they had dared to block him. The protagonist opened one eye to look at the director. She asked why he was acting that way. The brown-haired girl was a bit surprised to see Junwoo so upset about the situation. He explained that the president had been the first to interfere with him. Lee asked what the whole thing was about. A group of 4 janitors was in a dusty location. Lee explained that he had encountered them personally. The protagonist looked angrily out the car window. He replied that he didn't know anything and didn't remember anything. Their car was overtaking several trucks on the road. He concluded that once they arrived at the association, they would need to find that jumped guy. The protagonist was about to cross his arms, still angry. He asked the director for a picture of him and explained that everything needed to be resolved quietly before a scandal erupted. The headlights of a truck shone brightly in the distance. She agreed to the hunter's request. Lee looked back and saw Junwoo with his eyes closed. He was sad that everyone was tired of him and that there were so many idiots around. Suddenly, his eyes widened and he frowned. A huge truck was approaching, its headlights blinding. They froze instantly, overcome with fear. In front of their car, a truck changed lanes and was emitting smoke. There was a short distance between the vehicles. Junwoo extended his hand with his ability and avoided disaster. He had received the time-exceeded ability and activated it. Their car swerved away from the van with the help of a blue aura. The protagonist looked ahead through his bangs, disappointed. He realized that if he had been even 1 second late, his blood would have painted the asphalt, since that truck had no intention of stopping. 2 more trucks were coming toward the van. The protagonist figured the driver was drunk. The brunette leaned forward over the steering wheel, agitated. She didn't know what was happening. The car came to a sudden stop on the shoulder. He commented that he was already in a bad mood, and then this happened. He got out of the car and walked toward the truck, trying to understand what had happened to the driver. Suddenly, the ground cracked near the protagonist's foot. A bunch of handcuffs burst from the ground and tried to grab Junwoo. They started to shackle him, and he was furious. He deeply furrowed his brow and bared his teeth as he looked at his hand. He realized it was a superpowered containment device because he couldn't move. The same truck with its headlights still on was approaching the hunter from behind. He was truly enraged, blinded by the lights. He clenched his fists tightly, trying to break free from the restraints. He couldn't use his abilities in that situation. The truck rammed into the hunter from behind. Blood gushed from his mouth and he gasped, defenseless. Another truck was coming from the front, intent on finishing him off. The 2 trucks collided and were supposed to crush his body. A powerful explosion occurred on the road from the impact. Ashes and fire burst into the air. The black silhouette of the protagonist stood at the epicenter of the explosion. He stood with his head down right in the middle of the fire. He smiled ironically and joked that today was definitely a bad day for him. Junu looked forward with his bloodthirsty red eyes smiling. He wondered who dared to attack him. An entire army of special forces was pointing their weapons at him and preparing to shoot. They began firing from all sides while he stood in the flames. He closed his eyes from which black blood was dripping. He realized it was a well-planned attack and that an ordinary hunter wouldn't have survived. It would have been instant death. The hunter stood with lightsabers in front of two monsters. He had already fought in thousands of battles. A horde of furious monsters tried to charge at the protagonist. He had fought in dungeons many times, always on the edge of life and death. The protagonist glared furiously at the monsters. He swung his blade and sliced through them. He considered himself the strongest. His blade had skillfully cut through many monsters. He knew he definitely wouldn't die from a human attack. He remembered kneeling with lightsabers. Now he was kneeling, surrounded by armed soldiers. He thought he had considered himself the strongest. Up until that moment, a weapon was pointed at his face. He saw a weapon with a blue light. A special forces soldier was pointing a blue light weapon at him. It was a titanium, a superpowered weapon used to clear dungeons. He looked ironically at the weapon pointed at his head, bleeding. He replied that it was a bit dangerous. That soldier shot the hunter in the head. A notification appeared saying that his lungs, heart, liver, brain, and other organs had suffered fatal damage. A second notification calculated the probability of resurrection. His hair was scattered on the blood-soaked ground. A notification appeared confirming that the cause of death had been verified. His lifeless, bloody body lay on the cold road. Suddenly, a wave of air appeared near the bridge. His body fell into the blue space along with the rubble. A notice appeared that the conditions for acquiring a hidden ability had been met as a result of death. His bloody hand was raised. A card appeared in the space in front of his floating body. It was a hidden karma ability. A notice appeared with that hidden karma ability, thanks to which he was sent back 10 years in time. It was a large coastal city with the sunset in the background. His profession after returning would be determined based on the karma of his past life. The man was holding a bag with the remains of a monster. The profession definition was underway. At his feet was a bag with a monster's head and hand. The profession definition was completed. The protagonist put his hands on his waist and looked ahead. A group of janitors was cleaning up the monster remains from the area. The janitors were trying to finish up because there were only 45 minutes left before the next dungeon. Someone ordered the protagonist to quickly move the monster corpses to the furnace. Notifications started to appear. His profession was linked to the Korean Association for the Management of Other Dimensions, and he became a member of the dungeon cleaning team. The young Junu Kim looked up and sighed heavily, realizing his situation. After a flashback, our protagonist suddenly woke up in bed. He sat up with an irritated look, realizing he had had a stupid dream. His hand was resting on the blanket. He wondered how long he had been asleep, as his entire body was numb. Junu Kim looked forward through his bangs, stunned. He saw a destroyed, trash-filled room in front of him. He didn't understand where he was. In the corner of the room, there were two tied-up trash bags. The hunter realized even a pigsty would look better than that closet. The protagonist understood that the place couldn't be his apartment. A dirty, worn-out toilet was in the room. He realized it was a bathroom even smaller than the one in his home. He remembered the image of director Lee, who looked worn out. The protagonist noticed that this couldn't be the brown-haired girl's house. He thought that even if the whole world collapsed, Lee would never take him to her place. The protagonist looked into another room through the wall. He tried to understand what kind of place that was. He frowned, looking ahead, trying to notice something. A notification appeared stating that the fact of death had been confirmed, and as a result of death, the conditions for acquiring a hidden skill had been met. The protagonist remembered the moment his body was falling through space. He touched his head with a displeased expression. He realized it said death had been confirmed. He didn't understand what kind of absurdity was happening around him. He looked forward, stunned at his reflection in the mirror. It was himself from 10 years ago, or more precisely, Junu Kim at 28 years old. He stared at the mirror in shock, irritated and trying to understand what was happening. He opened his mouth and was about to open the system. A card with a hidden karma skill appeared. The protagonist looked at the card, shocked. It was a hidden skill, and its main acquisition condition was death. Due to the effect of that skill, he had returned 10 years in time, and it was impossible to cancel on his own. He fell backward in shock upon reading the card. He realized this wasn't a dream. He laughed sarcastically, realizing he had really died. Thanks to the skill's effect, the card granted him a new profession. He bared his teeth in outrage. At 18, he became a hunter, and by 28, he had reached level O. At that time, he was 22nd in the country and 525th in the world. 10 years ago, he was still a hunter. His past image, surrounded by aura, looked sharply ahead. He was a rising star, watched by the public with interest. His full silhouette stood atop a pile of monster corpses. A card with his new dungeon cleaner profession appeared. He was perplexed that after being a great hunter, he was now a cleaner. The protagonist stared in shock at the new conditions to remove this skill. He had to assume the position of Secretary General of the International Association within 5 years. Upon achieving this, his skills would be automatically unlocked and he would return to life before death. If he failed, the hunter would disappear forever. His eyes locked on the removal condition tied to the Secretary General position. He realized that if he succeeded, he returned to his past life. He fell to the ground, supported by his hands. He realized in horror that if he failed, he would rot away cleaning. He tried to understand how something like that was possible. They were transported to the International Association of Supernatural Abilities. There were two tall buildings connected to each other. He imagined his image against the black silhouette of the association chief and its flames. He knew this was an international organization that oversaw all associations in the world. The Secretary General of such a place had even more power than the President of the United States. In short, it was the position of the most influential person in the world. He realized that not even an SS ranker could be a candidate. The protagonist looked forward, confused, sitting on the floor. He tried to understand how he could assume such a position, especially in 5 years. He thought it was impossible because even if he ignored the fact that he didn't want to, it was simply unrealistic. He started getting up, supporting himself on one knee. He angrily tapped on the system screen. He decided to ignore that condition, realizing it didn't make a difference. Junwoo understood that he could survive if he became a CEO. The protagonist cautiously looked at the system screen. He realized it would be more profitable to become a hunter. Junwoo thought that with his skills, he could immediately rise to SSS rank. He accessed the system and saw that his skills were blocked. He was surprised by this news. He became tense and smirked maliciously. He didn't understand what kind of karma had fallen upon him. Suddenly, a notification with a new skill appeared before the protagonist. He immediately got excited and looked with anticipation at what was happening. He thought even a regular skill would be enough. A shining card with the passive skill Misophobia with a cleaning effect appeared. The protagonist bared his teeth and frowned at such a skill. He entered the room and the door opened. He threw himself on the bed with his arms spread out. He knew he had died and upon waking up, found himself in the past. And in an instant, from an SSL level hunter, he became a cleaner. He remembered his skill card now inaccessible to him. He remembered that all of his abilities were sealed and all of his achievements had also vanished. He sighed heavily and looked up at the ceiling in displeasure. He tried to figure out what to do now, and if he really had to clean. He closed his eyes indignantly, struggling hard. He believed he had pride as an SSS level hunter and didn't want to be a cleaner. Junwoo remembered those same fighters who killed him. He was going to find out who the villains were who destroyed him, because he knew they weren't regular soldiers. He imagined 3 fighters with a white flag. The protagonist thought it could be a private guild. He imagined 3 other dark-haired fighters with swords, thinking they might be people from the association. He had another option. Suddenly, an unknown call rang on his phone. He put the phone to his ear and was about to speak. It was Juntae, who already knew him. The protagonist cautiously looked to the side. Juntae, on the other end, asked why he hadn't gone to work. The protagonist was surprised by this as he knew there was no such person among his acquaintances. Juntae smirked maliciously, holding the phone to his ear. He told Junwoo he was already an hour late. He thought the guy must be sick, since last time he had faced a tough dungeon. The main character immediately got up with a serious expression. He remembered that he now worked as a dungeon cleaner. Yunta laughed over the phone while the other workers looked on disapprovingly. Junwoo said over the phone that last time wasn't easy and that today wouldn't be so hard. Another dark-haired guy was surprised by this reason. He thought that lazy guy didn't go to work because he was going through a rough patch. The 2 guys discussed the situation while Juntae spoke on the phone. The cleaner said Junwoo wasn't the first to run away after the first day of work, so he wondered why Juntae had called him. The other dark-haired cleaner was outraged by the incident, thinking that if Junwoo couldn't work there, he should at least have called to inform them. The main character tensed upon hearing the colleagues' discontented exclamations. They didn't want to continue the conversation because they knew he wouldn't show up. The protagonist understood that regardless of who he was now, he couldn't afford to be humiliated by some cleaners. He was indignant, realizing he had truly died. He bit his finger and tensed with anger. Juntae looked at his indignant colleagues with an offended and irritated gaze. He told them to be quiet, explaining that life has different circumstances. The protagonist slightly opened his eyes upon hearing the co-workers' conversation. Junta told him that if Junwoo was struggling, he could rest that day. He added that Junwoo should at least inform them next time or send a message. Junta looked at the phone in shock as Jun shouted at him. Junta said he could have just messaged that number and saved the contact as Junta. Jun tried asking again for his name. The protagonist was shocked as Junta laughed at what he heard. The head cleaner sneered, saying his name wasn't that easy to remember. The protagonist already knew that name. Junta smiled broadly, holding the phone to his ear. The head cleaner concluded that the guy could rest that day and added that if he could, he should come next time. Junwoo promptly replied that he would come right now. The protagonist grabbed his coat and headed for the exit. He said he was going to work right away. A large bus traveled down the city road. The protagonist was slightly irritated, imagining his clothes in his car. At first, he was surprised not to find normal clothes at home, and even more surprised when he left and didn't find his supercar. He was sitting on the bus by the window. He still wanted to take a taxi, but his wallet was empty. He ironically commented that the once great hunter now rode the bus. That really irritated him. The protagonist, with a furious look, imagined his 2 images. He realized he was living a completely different life now, which meant the incident of attacking Junta had never happened. Jun understood that it had nothing to do with him anymore. The protagonist realized that if Junta had been the one who killed him in his past life, then everything changed. The brown-haired man slightly furrowed his brow. He considered his death very strange. The protagonist remembered getting out of the car after that accident. The man understood that someone had set up the accident to get his attention. The brown-haired man remembered being handcuffed. Junwoo understood that they used a special device on him so he couldn't use his abilities. The protagonist remembered how a gun had been pointed at his head, and the final moment was that the weapon that shot him wasn't ordinary. The man imagined a gun in a case. He knew it was a superpowered titanium weapon used to attack monsters. That kind of weapon was considered top tier among all types of armaments, and its price and quality were impressive. The main character imagined Jumtae, who smiled maliciously. Junwoo understood that a dungeon cleaner like Jumtae wouldn't be capable of executing such a task. However, he realized Jumtae could very well have hired someone to get revenge on him. Junwoo also imagined a malicious image of his son, who also disliked him. The brown-haired man sat on the bus with his arms crossed and an irritated look. He smiled ironically at the thought that he had merely pushed Jumtae, and they were already calling it assault. He looked straight ahead from under his bangs. Now he realized he should have listened from the start. Jumtae looked at the protagonist with a stern expression. He asked the young man to cancel it. The brown-haired man closely observed the frightened cleaner. The main character still didn't understand who was in front of him. The man immediately said he was from the dungeon cleaning team named Jumtae. The young man looked at the cleaner with disdain, realizing he had never heard that name before. He asked Jumtae what business he had with him. The head cleaner looked at his interlocutor with malice. He informed him that the young man had suggested to management that their department be downsized, even though they were already understaffed. He explained that the situation was difficult now, and reducing the team further would only make it worse. The two argued intensely in the hallway near the panoramic window. Junwoo asked why Jumtae was addressing him directly. The cleaner looked the protagonist in the eyes. Junwoo said it was just a suggestion since he had no authority, as those decisions were made by the management department, and told them they should go there. Jumtae explained that everyone knew his influence was considerable. He added that with just one word from him, the association would do anything. Realizing that cutting their team meant nothing to Junwoo, Jumtae grimaced and lowered his head. He still insisted that they shouldn't have been cut and asked Junwoo to reconsider the decision. The protagonist scratched his neck and looked at the cleaner. He assumed the rumors had reached them that he had proposed the staff cut. However, he didn't think they would confront him directly. The protagonist furrowed his brow as he looked ahead. He understood that Jumtae's gaze meant they wouldn't leave him alone. The cleaner stared at Junwoo with contempt. The brown-haired man looked ahead from under his long bangs. He observed that people said it was harmful for a lizard to lose its tail. The shadow from the window cast itself over Junwoo and Jumtae as they spoke. The cleaner didn't understand what they were talking about. The brown-haired man added that when a lizard was in danger, it would drop its tail without hesitation. He asked Junto why that happened. The protagonist, with a furious expression, pictured a tailless lizard. He explained that in this way, the creature was able to survive. Junwoo noted that, as ineffective and disadvantageous as it might be, it was the only way to stay alive, calling this phenomenon a last resort. The cleaner had his back turned and a bald spot was visible on his head. He tried to understand the essence of what was happening. The brown-haired man with a tense expression approached the frightened Jumtae. He angrily explained that Jumtae was not a tail, and he knew that very well. He explained that every person considered themselves a necessary being in this world. The protagonist looked at the cleaner with disdain, moving closer. He asked the cleaner if he really thought that way. Jumtae looked at the young man with fear in his eyes. Junwoo explained that the association was facing financial difficulties, and for that reason, management wanted to review the hunters' salaries. The cleaner wondered if they were going to be fired because of their own wages. The protagonist looked angrily at the cleaner. He explained that the main task of the association was to protect citizens from monsters and dungeons, and that's what the hunters did. The protagonist immediately turned and was about to leave Jumtae behind. The young man asked if the hunters were supposed to work without receiving anything for their efforts. He questioned how they would clean the dungeons under those conditions. He explained that this was why he had to resort to the last resort. The cleaner was outraged by this, asking the brown-haired man if he had ever seen the limit. Jumtae was very angry and shouted at the protagonist. Junwoo observed that the cleaners actually did nothing. Jumtae immediately retorted angrily that the young man didn't even know what their job was. The protagonist turned around with a furious look. He explained that they only cleaned, and that was it. He concluded that they could hire workers later, but now he was telling them to accept things as they were. The hunter immediately turned and walked away. The cleaner shouted that they also had their pride. He replied with an ironic smile that he didn't doubt it because that should have already been done years ago. He added that he tolerated all of it because of a colleague. His shoes stepped on the ground. The cleaner shouted a question about what Junwoo had said, that the most important thing for the association was protecting the citizens. Jumtae felt his knees and put his hands on his body. He said they were also citizens and begged the protagonist to reverse his decision. The protagonist approached Jumtae with a clenched fist. He observed that the cleaner was getting on his nerves. He thought he had explained everything clearly, but in the end, it wasn't enough. The protagonist bent over in front of the frightened Jumtae with a look of contempt. He stated that people like the cleaners should be grateful. He explained that they didn't face monsters or risk their lives. He noted that they just cleaned up after the hunters and got paid for it. Junwoo added that they had to be content with what they had and didn't understand where all the demands were coming from. The head cleaner frowned when the protagonist called them parasites. Junta grabbed the young man by the coat in fury. He asked him to repeat what he had just said. The main character immediately threw the cleaner against the wall. The protagonist scratched his neck while looking at the cleaner. He understood what was going on. Junta was sitting against the wall, angry and covered in blood. Junwoo was outraged by this. The brown-haired man looked at the cleaner with a wicked smile, holding his phone in his hands. He called Lee, telling him to deal with that janitor. He asked the director not to involve him in that kind of matter. The protagonist got off the bus and stepped onto the street. A group of workers and rescue personnel surrounded the gate that had appeared. He knew it was a yellow-level dungeon and that it was considered dangerous. He remembered being surrounded by a giant monstrous serpent. He thought the boss of that dungeon was probably the Foxtrot Centipede. At age 28, he participated in that raid. The protagonist looked ahead, where Lee stood with his hands in his pockets. He realized he had truly gone back 10 years in the past. Gyuntuk shouted from the side the name of the protagonist who had noticed. He had finally found the person who did that to him. He averted his gaze in contempt. Juntae opened a wide smile and immediately greeted Junwoo with joy, waiting for his arrival. It was Juntae. The man smiled broadly, closing his eyes. He turned to Junwoo, asking why he had come. Junwoo pressed his lips together in displeasure. He thought he had finally found the one who had done that to him. Junwoo looked at the man with an unfriendly expression. He thought the man was the dungeon cleaner Juntae. Juntae put his hands on his hips, looking at the hunter with a cheerful smile. He asked what he was staring at. The hunter thought Juntae was just an ordinary man in his 50s, wearing cheap work clothes and looked exactly as he remembered. The hunter squinted at the cleaner, approaching him. The protagonist thought the cleaner didn't look like someone capable of killing a person. Juntae asked the protagonist if he had had breakfast. Juntae patted the protagonist on the back in front of the others. He told the guys he had said before that Junwoo would come, and that he seemed like a sensible guy from the start. The dark-haired one looked at the protagonist irritably, raising an eyebrow. Sang-hyuk, Dungeon Cleaning Department number 3. Sang-hyuk said it was obvious the protagonist wanted to skip work, but it didn't work out, so he came. The brown-haired boy looked at the protagonist unhappily, frowning. Huijing, Dungeon Cleaning Department number 3. Huijing asked Juntae how sensible he really was, noting that last time he said he couldn't take it anymore and did nothing. The girl looked at Juntae with a cautious and suspicious gaze. Soyeon told Juntae that 4 people were enough, asking why he kept trying to bring someone else. The cleaner approached the colleagues, who looked at the protagonist with displeasure. Juntae told the guys to stop, and since everyone was there, it was time to start working. Juntae asked Sang-hyuk how much time they had left. Sang-hyuk said they had 45 minutes. The guys turned their attention to the golden glow. Juntae noted that the time was very short, to which Sang-hyuk replied that it was Junwoo's fault, who was an hour late. Junwoo thought they were all annoying him. The cleaner turned to the guys, putting his hands on his hips. He said there was nothing they could do, and that they had to hurry before they got scolded again. Juntae approached the protagonist, placing a gas mask in his hands. Juntae told the protagonist to take it, and that it would probably fit him. The hunter looked at the gas mask in perplexity. Juntae raised an eyebrow, looking at the hunter with a confused expression. He asked Junwoo what was wrong with him, and if he had some kind of problem. Junwoo said it wasn't a problem. The hunter raised an eyebrow, looking at the cleaner with a confused expression. He asked Juntae what exactly the dungeon cleaning team did. White clouds floated above the tall building, and an orange sunset could be seen. The Korean Association for Other Dimension Management. Junwoo noted that the association was divided into 4 departments. A distribution chart of the Korean Association for Other Dimension Management appeared. The Management Department, the Hunter Support Department, the Operations Department, and the Dungeon Cleaning Department. There were people in the office doing their jobs. The protagonist thought that the Management Department monitored the dungeons and collected information. Workers were in the room with the capsules. The Hunter added that the manufacturing, supplying of weapons and items, and support for general activities were provided by the Hunter Support Department. People in black suits stood near the dead monster bodies. The protagonist thought that the Hunters in the Operations Department attacked the monsters in the dungeons. Guys with gas masks followed Juntae into the dungeon. Juntae asked Huijing if he was processing, to which Huijing replied that he was, but the path was too wide, noting that he thought the chemical wouldn't be enough. Juntae told Huijing to spray more and that it would be enough. Juntae told Sang-hyuk to check the location of the boss room. Juntae told Soyeon to check the gas readings inside the dungeon. Juntae added that the boss was very large that time and that cleaning it would take a bit longer, so they should hurry. The protagonist squinted, looking at the guys' backs. Junwoo thought, what else he didn't know what the dungeon cleaning department did. The hunter thought the guys were pretending to be busy. The hunter turned sharply, walking away from the group. Juntae looked at the protagonist in shock as he turned around. The cleaner asked the hunter where he was going, noting that you can't walk alone in a circular-type dungeon, as it's dangerous. The protagonist frowned, squinting at the cleaner. The hunter told the man that he himself had said they were going to the boss room, to which the man replied that's exactly what he was saying, and that he just needed to follow him as the boss room was on the other side. The protagonist pointed with his finger to the hallway leading to the railway line. Junwoo asked Juntae what he was talking about since the room was in that direction. Sang-hyuk brought his hand to his head, looking at the protagonist in confusion. He asked Juntae what kind of nonsense he was saying. So-yeon raised her eyebrows and looked at the hunter with concern. The girl told the protagonist that if he didn't want to work, he should just say so. Huijing said that either way they didn't have time, asking what it was this time. The protagonist put his hands in his pants pockets looking at the guys. Huijing told the others to ignore him, suggesting they head to where they were going. Sang-hyuk approached the hunter, pressing a piece of paper to his chest. He told Junwoo that it was the map given to him by the management department and to check for himself where the boss room was. The protagonist looked at the map where the room was marked with a red dot. The protagonist thought that after cleaning the dungeon with the help of the hunters who joined the raid, a map was created. Sang-hyuk stared at the protagonist with furrowed brows. Junwoo thought there could be no mistakes in a map made by the management department. The protagonist threw the map away, turning his back to Sang-hyuk. He said the map was wrong and that they would go that way, noting that he didn't think it was possible for the management department to make a mistake, asking how they even work. Sang-hyuk looked at the protagonist with a crazed look, while Juntae was perplexed. Sang-hyuk said anyone would go crazy, and asked the chief if Junwoo had lost his mind. The chief asked Junwoo why he was so sure about that. The hunter cast a sideways glance at the chief. He said it didn't matter since he had cleaned that dungeon, and then suddenly went silent. The chief frowned, looking closely at the hunter. He asked about the cleaned dungeon. The protagonist stood still, thinking that even if he told them, they wouldn't believe him. The protagonist closed his eyes and addressed the guys. He said it was nothing special and suggested they keep going. The guys cast sideways glances at the protagonist, who walked beside Juntae. The hunter looked straight ahead, while Juntae looked upward. The hunter asked Juntae what the remaining 45 minutes meant. Juntae said it was the time until the dungeon closed, asking if he had heard of that. The protagonist kept looking ahead. He thought he understood what he was talking about. The protagonist remembered how he used to leave the dungeon with his team. Junwoo noted that all dungeons naturally disappear after being cleared, and that this time is usually 2 hours after the end of the raid. Junwoo added that he had never thought about it, since the hunters always left immediately. But for the cleaning team, this time was very important. Juntae closed his eyes, while the hunter turned to look at him. The protagonist asked the chief that if the dungeon would disappear anyway, why clean it? The chief said he apparently didn't know. The chief opened his eyes, looking at the protagonist. He said a clean dungeon doesn't disappear, but goes to a resting area until a monster appears there again. Juntae looked at the protagonist, continuing down the indicated path. Junwoo told the chief that he knew that. Juntae told Junwoo that he would soon understand what would happen if the dungeon reopened and there was a pile of corpses there. The hunter said he didn't think it was that important. The chief closed his eyes, turning his head away from the hunter. He said that first it would make it harder for hunters to find their way. Juntae imagined the hunters and the green smoke that made the hunter grab his own throat. The chief said the gas released from decomposing monsters was very dangerous, and that if there were too many corpses, it would limit the hunter's actions, which would affect monster attacks and cleaning. The protagonist looked ahead with a serious expression. He agreed with Juntae. The chief slightly opened his eyes, glowing with pride. He said that simply put, they helped the hunters focus on the raid and clear the dungeons in peace, and that they should be proud of the work they did. The chief closed his eyes and placed his hands at his sides. He said that without them, there would be no hunters. The protagonist thought, what nonsense. So-yeon held a sprayer in her hand while Sang-hyuk looked at the map. The chief said the main function of their team was to clean up monster corpses and debris inside the dungeon, and that they also checked to see if any hunters had been left behind. Juntae added that if that happened, they could save them, although that had never happened before. The protagonist walked down the corridor with a confused expression. He wondered how cleaners could possibly save hunters, noting that he had never heard of such a thing in his entire life. The protagonist thought he still couldn't say the cleaners were just taking a break. The cleaning team approached a large wooden door. Sang-hyuk said they had arrived, and according to the map, that was the boss room. Sang-hyuk clenched his fist and touched the door. He removed the gas mask from his face, looking ahead in shock. He didn't understand what that was. The door disappeared in front of the guys, revealing an empty wall. Sang-hyuk said that wasn't what they were looking for. He looked back as the others stared at the wall in confusion. Junwoo said he had told them the boss room wasn't there. Huijing asked what that was, admitting it was true. Sang-hyuk asked how this could have happened. The guys gathered around while hunters nearby looked at them. Sang-hyuk asked the chief what they were going to do. Huijing said that since this had happened, he asked the chief if he could leave, adding they could just consider it wasn't their day. Juntae asked the team how many minutes were left. The boys exchanged serious glances in a circle. Sang-hyuk said 22 minutes remained. The chief said he thought that was enough time and asked how they were counting. Sang-hyuk looked at Juntae with a smile, while the other guys watched him with serious expressions. Sang-hyuk said it was better than nothing. Huijing agreed with Sang-hyuk. Soyeon added that meant it was unanimous and that it was better to head back right away. The protagonist looked at the boys suspiciously, spreading his arms out to the sides. He asked if that was supposed to be enough for what. The chief smiled broadly as he looked at the protagonist. Junta told Junwoo that there was enough time to work and that they needed to finish what they were doing. Junwoo noted they said 22 minutes were left and asked Junta what they would do if the dungeon closed. The protagonist looked at the chief with apprehension, who laughed at him. Junwoo said it would be at least a week before the dungeon opened again, and at most a year. The chief closed his eyes, glowing with joy. He said that meant getting stuck in a dungeon. Junwoo thought that getting trapped in a dungeon for an entire year basically meant signing his own death sentence. The hunter bared his teeth, frowning in disgust. The protagonist told the group they were all crazy, risking their lives for a job like dungeon cleaner. He smiled irritably at his chief. Junta asked Junwoo what his problem was, saying that this was their job. Junta told the team they had to hurry. The protagonist turned his back to the group, baring his teeth. Sang-hyuk told Junwoo that if he didn't like it, he could just leave first, adding that they weren't counting on him anyway. Huijing said fine. They'd go without him, especially since it looked like this was his first time in a dungeon, and added that he didn't want to work in the first place. The protagonist turned his head to the side just as Soyeon appeared in front of him. She looked at the protagonist with displeasure, pressing her lips together. Junwoo stood alone in the dungeon. He recalled the times when he was a hunter, clearing dungeons with a face full of anger. Junwoo thought he had 15 years of experience as a hunter, and during that time he had never failed a raid. As a result, he became the first in the world to reach SSS level and hold the #1 spot in the world rankings. The hunter thought that no one had ever complained about the dungeons he cleared, adding that was who he used to be. And now even a few janitors didn't take him seriously. The protagonist smiled madly. The boys suddenly stopped and looked at the protagonist. Junwoo told the team there was a small passage in that room. Sang-hyuk frowned and looked at him with narrowed eyes. He said Junwoo was up to something again. Sang-hyuk widened his eyes, looking at the hunter. Junwoo told Sang-hyuk to shut up and listen. The protagonist glared at the group with a furious look. He said that from there to the boss room it was about 500 meters, and through that passage they'd get there in 8 minutes. Or 5 if they ran. The guys looked at the protagonist in confusion as he headed toward the passage. Junwoo said he'd go first now, and if they didn't like it, they could leave the dungeon. Juntae asked the protagonist to wait. The passage to the boss room was filled with dirt and dust. The team ran through the corridor. The protagonist stopped at the stone gate. The hunter looked into the room with a serious expression. The team behind the protagonist stared in shock at the boss room entrance. Inside, there was a huge red monster with blades protruding from its head. Junwoo thought it was the foxtrot centipede, the boss, a monster whose body was about 10 meters long. Sang-hyuk's mouth fell open as he stared at the massive monster. He remarked that it really was the boss room. The room was full of wreckage and looked damaged. The protagonist thought a fierce battle had taken place based on the condition of the room, noting there had been a team of 20 people and at least 5 or 6 casualties. He noticed a sword impaled in the centipede's head, with blood dripping down. He thought they had finally found its weak spot, noting that it was the bridge of the nose and the cavity just above its massive chin. The protagonist stood near the monster's head as Sang-hyuk approached him. Sang-hyuk said there wasn't any time and they needed to start cleaning right away. The protagonist reached out his hand, blocking Sang-hyuk's path. Sang-hyuk asked what he was doing, saying there wasn't any time. He added, was he now going to blame them for picking the wrong boss room? The monster's eyes glowed red. The centipede rose from the floor, opening its mouth wide. The team looked at the monster in horror, baring their teeth. They couldn't understand how this was possible. It was supposed to be dead. The protagonist narrowed his eyes at the centipede, frowning. Junwoo thought this was already a problem. The huge centipede looked at the boys with a furious gaze. The protagonist cautiously watched the monster. He thought it was a massive headache, and that without abilities, it would be difficult to attack it. Suddenly, the centipede fell to the ground. The boys looked at the monster with wary eyes. The protagonist thought they were just post-mortem spasms, noting that the operations department workers hadn't even checked everything properly. Huijing said he was scared to death. The centipede remained motionless on the floor. Huijing pulled out a knife as the protagonist glanced sideways at him. Huijing asked the protagonist if it was his first time seeing a boss, telling him to step aside. The protagonist widened his eyes, glaring at Huijing with irritation. Huijing said he was in shock, and if you couldn't touch the monster, then you should move out of the way. The protagonist growled at Huijing in anger, frowning. He thought about what that bastard had said about him. Junwoo snatched the knife from the cleaner's hand with disgust. The hunter said he was speechless, and told Huijing to hand over the knife. The hunter walked toward the monster, holding the knife as the others watched. The cleaner asked the hunter what he was suddenly doing. The protagonist placed his foot on the monster, holding the knife and looking to the side. Junwoo told the boys it was necessary to cut, and that if they used the knife incorrectly, they might dislocate their wrists. The protagonist lowered the knife, making an incision on the monster's body. He told the colleagues that as they could see, it was necessary to make cuts between sections 3, 6, and 12, adding that it wasn't worth wasting effort on other parts since it wouldn't be necessary. The protagonist looked at the monster's body with a serious expression. He said the nerves were still alive, and they shouldn't worry if it started to move. The boys look at the protagonist, confused, gritting their teeth. The protagonist looked at the colleagues who were paralyzed with shock. Junwoo asked the colleagues why they were standing still, and if they were just going to keep watching. Junta said of course not, and suggested that the boys get to work. The protagonist said with irritation that the monster was slightly tilted and that they needed to lift it, asking if that's how they were supposed to cut. Junwoo added that they shouldn't touch the tail, as its venom had already killed many hunters. The boys thought sadly that Junwoo was really grumpy. The protagonist pointed a finger at his colleagues with displeasure. He told them not to step in the blood because although it wasn't poisonous, it was very sticky. Sang-hyuk looked at his superior with irritation. He asked Junta if he had shown the management department files because he wanted to help the rookie. Junta said he hadn't done any of that. Sang-hyuk widened his eyes in confusion as Junwoo continued cutting the monster. Sang-hyuk told his superior not to lie, asking how a rookie could know all that. The superior pointed out that even if he had shown the files, there wasn't that kind of information in them. The protagonist, covered in mud, looked at the centipede. Sang-hyuk asked the superior how he knew all of that, to which Junta replied that he had no idea. The hunter stared at the centipede. Behind the protagonist, a system notification appeared about the activation of the passive skill Misophobia. A bloody knife lay on the dirty floor. Bags of flesh were in front of the monster's skeleton. The boys said they had finished cutting the carcass. The protagonist wiped his forehead, seeming pleased. Suddenly, the protagonist was shocked by his own realization. He didn't understand why he felt so much satisfaction. The protagonist's colleague was watching him. The boss happily asked Junwoo if that was really his first time doing this job. Sang-hyuk, displeased, said he had done his part, to which Soyeon replied that he had practically done everything alone. The protagonist pressed his lips together, looking at the boys. He thought he had a strange feeling because of the cleanup. Huijing said a real rising star had appeared before them, adding that he was a rival to Sang-hyuk. Sang-hyuk told Huijing to stop mocking him. Sang-hyuk looked at his watch, checking the time. He said it was time to leave since there were 5 minutes left. The boss said that was enough and that everyone had done a great job. The boys, after working hard, headed toward the dungeon exit. The boss smiled slightly as Junwoo walked behind. The boss told Ju that everything had been resolved quite smoothly thanks to him. The protagonist stepped into the monster's black blood. The hunter thought there must be a hole in the bag, which is why the blood had started leaking. Soyeon looked straight ahead, worried. Sang-hyuk told Junwoo that he had been the one to tell them to be careful, and yet he stepped there. Soyeon told the boss that the protagonist couldn't move. The protagonist closed his eyes and turned his head to the side. He told the guys to stop overreacting, noting that he was fine, and asked them to back off. The hunter remembered the dead centipede. He thought that the monster's blood was extremely sticky, and that even when he was a hunter, he couldn't deal with it. The protagonist reached out his hand in front of him. He thought that, however, the effect of the high temperature was decreasing, and that he would be able to get out easily. The protagonist's hand glowed intensely, causing red lightning to spark. System notification: Fire Flower skill activated. The guys watched as the protagonist failed to use the skill and it faded. System notification: skill cannot be used. This skill is sealed. The protagonist looked at the ground, perplexed, eyes wide open. He said this was terrible. The boss looked straight ahead, concerned. He asked Huijing if he had brought a rope with him. The boss told Huijing to tie it quickly, and the others to hold him from behind. The protagonist spread his arms to the sides while Huijing tied the rope around him. Huijing said it was tied. The guys pulled the rope, dragging the protagonist toward them. Junta told the guys to pull with all the strength they had. The protagonist remained still, unmoving in a pool of blood. He looked confused at the guys who were trying to pull him out. The cleaner said he hadn't even budged. The boss asked what was wrong with the restriction. The protagonist was stuck to the floor, saying that Hayek had said there was 1 minute left, then 55 seconds. The boss told them to pull again. The protagonist didn't understand what was happening. The guys looked at the protagonist with concern, their eyes wide. The boss told Junwoo they were failing and that he should take off the suit quickly. Soyeon said the gas concentration was too high and that it was dangerous. The boss looked at Soyeon furiously, frowning. He asked the girl if she wanted to stay there. Junwoo widened his eyes, watching his colleagues. He didn't understand what they were talking about. After all, he was the one who couldn't move. So why did the boss say everyone would stay there? Junwoo stood in front of the guys, stunned, while they held the rope. Junwoo thought a lizard would shed its own tail to survive, not understanding why, in a situation like this, they didn't just abandon him. The boss opened his mouth wide, showing his teeth. He shouted at the protagonist, asking how much he was worth, and told him to take off the suit, adding that he should get a grip. The hunter began taking off the jumpsuit, looking at the guys. He thought their intelligence was lower than that of a lizard, noting that Hayek looked shocked at the boss's back. Junta told the boys that it wouldn't work that way and that they should head out. Sang-hyuk asked Juntae and him. Sang-hyuk pressed his hand against his chest, looking at Juntae with confidence. The boss said they should survive, to which Sang-hyuk responded that it would be better if it were him. The boss stood still with a serious expression. He told the boys that it was an order and they should leave immediately. Sang-hyuk looked at the boss with a worried expression, eyebrows furrowed. He turned toward the exit, looking apprehensive. The cleaner told the boss there were 10 seconds left. The boss moved toward the protagonist while the boys ran toward the exit. A timer appeared, showing a countdown from 10. The boss began helping the protagonist remove his clothes. The boss started taking off his own clothes as Junwoo watched. The boss gave his suit to the protagonist and both headed toward the exit. The protagonist's dirty suit remained in a pool of blood. The cleaners waited near the dungeon for the boys. The boys were frightened, their mouths agape. The boss grabbed the protagonist, struggling to reach the exit. The protagonist extended his hand toward the bright light. He widened his eyes, looking at the passage with hope. The dungeon entrance closed, leaving behind a golden light. The boys looked worriedly at the dungeon exit. The boss, along with the protagonist, made it out. The boys ran to the boss with happy faces. Juntae closed his eyes and smiled happily. The protagonist lay on the ground, staring blankly at the sky. He didn't understand what was happening as he had nearly died just now. The protagonist opened his mouth in surprise. He noticed that there hadn't been a single monster in that dungeon while he was cleaning. The boss reached out to the protagonist. He asked if he was okay. Juntae replied that he was fine. The boss said that the gas concentration was lower than they had thought, noting that it was a relief. The protagonist looked at Juntae, who was smiling with irritation. The boss told the hunter that it was his first dungeon and he had sweated a lot, adding that they would consider it training. Junwoo wondered what kind of training he was talking about since he had almost died. The protagonist frowned, looking at the boss, bewildered. The hunter asked Juntae what he meant that it was his first dungeon. Juntae replied that this was just the beginning. The boss, happy, extended his palm, showing the number 5 with his fingers. Junwoo asked Juntae how much was left. The protagonist felt like he had been struck by lightning, making him freeze. Junwoo imagined himself surrounded by his colleagues under the distribution system. It was the diagram of the Korean Association for Other Dimensions Management, which included the management department, the hunter support department, and the operations department. He thought that in Seoul alone there were 8 dungeon cleaning teams and 96 across the country. And if they included freelancers who were not part of the association, there would be about 11,300 hunters in Korea. The protagonist introduced the boss under the system board. This was the dungeon cleaning department. Junwoo noted that there were only 5 cleaning teams, which meant 25 people. The protagonist imagined the dead bodies of monsters on the ground. He thought that each team had to clean an average of 3 dungeons per day, and if they were unlucky, they might clean 5. The protagonist opened his mouth and it seemed like his spirit was leaving it. Junwoo thought he had also been unlucky that day. Night fell over the city. Juntae said that although they were having a bad day, he would throw a company party later. One of the boys asked the boss if he was really treating them that day too. The hunter was facing away from the boys, who were chatting among themselves. Juntae told the boys that bosses usually pay for company events. Huijing told Juntae that if he paid every time, soon he'd have nothing left to live on. Soyeon said the salary difference was small, offering to pitch in that day. Juntae said he didn't want to lose face. The boss turned to the protagonist, smiling broadly. He asked the hunter if he would join them, since he had worked the most. The hunter looked at the boss with satisfaction. Juntae asked Junwoo what he wanted for dinner. Huijing told the protagonist to decide quickly, as he was already tired of standing around. The boss asked Junwoo why he was just standing there. The protagonist looked at the boss with a serious face. He told him he wouldn't go. The boys looked at the hunter, surprised, mouths open. Junwoo continued to look at the boys. He thought there was no point in starting any kind of communication with those people. The boss crossed his arms and smiled. He told Junwoo not to worry, as office parties were optional. The protagonist slightly opened his mouth, looking a bit confused. He said it wasn't about that. The protagonist turned his back to the boss and began to walk away. Junwoo told Juntae to forget what he had said. The protagonist lowered his hand, taking it off his head. Juntae told Junwoo he had done a good job. The boys looked at the protagonist, smiling. Soyeon told Junwoo they'd see him the next day. Sang-hyuk said goodbye to the protagonist. The protagonist turned his head, tightening his lips. The dark night sky stretched over the city. The hunter was lying in bed, looking at the ceiling. He thought that in his past life, it wasn't his boss who killed him, because he wasn't cruel enough to kill out of resentment. The protagonist placed his hands behind his head, frowning. He wondered who else might have held a grudge against him. The protagonist imagined 3 people. He thought of the youngest on the team, Kwanmo, whom he constantly scolded. The protagonist noted Yoo-jin, with whom he broke up, and they almost killed each other. The protagonist remembered Dong-hui from the management department, whom he constantly treated as his subordinate and refused to accept on his team. The protagonist smiled in irritation, frowning. He didn't understand why there were so many of them. The protagonist was lying on a bed surrounded by a mountain of trash. Junwoo asked what difference it made now, since whoever killed him probably didn't even know him in this life. The protagonist looked at the ceiling with a harsh gaze. He thought that if he wanted proper revenge, he would have to get rid of karma and return to his past life. The protagonist remembered the system notification about karma. Junwoo thought that to do that, he would have to become the Secretary General General of the International Association of Supernatural Abilities in 5 years. The protagonist smiled with displeasure, frowning. He said that if he had abilities, he could also become a hunter or find a way to join the management department. The protagonist suddenly got out of bed, opening the system window. The protagonist's eyes widened as he looked at the system in surprise. He thought he hadn't checked it properly in the morning because there were conditions for unlocking abilities. A card appeared with a description for unlocking abilities. The abilities were Fallen Angel, Border Breaker, Omnipotence, Scroll, and Demon King. The protagonist studied the system window with the abilities. He said that in that case, he didn't need to work as a cleaner and should check what the conditions were. The protagonist read the conditions, saying that the annual salary of a dungeon cleaning department employee had to be at least 60 million won. Juno added that the competition for a position in the dungeon cleaning department was at least 30 to 1. The protagonist read about the dungeon cleaning department and then fell silent. The hunter looked at the system furiously, baring his teeth. He asked if that was too much, noting that all the conditions were related to that department. The hunter held a plastic bottle in his hand. The protagonist threw the bottle toward the TV. He asked if that was what they wanted, for him to bury himself alive in that cleaning department. Juno sat on the bed, spreading his arms to the sides. The crumpled plastic bottle was on the floor. The protagonist bared his teeth and his eyes glowed blue. System alert, passive skill activated. Juno immediately began cleaning his dirty room. He wondered why the room was so filthy, and if he never cleaned in his past life. The hunter noticed that everything inside had simply rotted. The protagonist looked irritated until a system window appeared behind him. Juno said it was stressing him out that he couldn't even rest properly, and it was driving him crazy. System notification, the first condition to unlock was fulfilled. Go to work once. A system window appeared. The hyper-acceleration skill was unlocked. A man was sleeping on his shoulder, drooling. The protagonist thought it had already been a week since he had been taking the crowded bus every morning. The protagonist was on the bus, sitting near the window. He thought it had also been a week since he started working as a dungeon cleaner. The protagonist looked away. He thought that during that time he managed to clean 25 dungeons. The protagonist remembered himself cutting a monster. He thought he used 6 cans of the drug, 10 liters each, cut 30 monsters, and unlocked his abilities. System window, the hyper-acceleration skill was unlocked. During battle, the user's movement speed increases considerably. A system window appeared. The first condition to unlock the skill had been met. Go to work once. Juno thought it was because of that strange condition that he managed to unlock the skill. The protagonist remembered himself with a blue sword. He thought it was a very effective movement skill, but only when used together with an attack skill. The protagonist imagined himself in a cleaner's uniform, holding a mop. He thought that because of that stupid condition, he couldn't use it while cleaning. The protagonist smiled in irritation, frowning. He thought at least it was better than nothing. The protagonist remembered the system window with the conditions to unlock the skills. He thought that, realistically, he wouldn't be able to increase his annual salary to 60 million or make this profession the most popular. The protagonist looked out the window at the people passing by. Juno sighed heavily, crossing his arms over his chest. He noted that dungeon cleaning work is considered a dangerous occupation. The protagonist recalled the conditions to unlock the skills, his face serious. The skills were Circular Counterattack and Fire Flower. He thought, of course, they were relatively simple conditions to unlock, though a bit abstract. The sun shone brightly above the tall building. He thought the simplest thing would be to increase the association's interest in the dungeon cleaning department. The protagonist imagined himself giving a presentation to the workers. He thought that if he, a former SSS rank hunter, used the cleaning information accumulated over 10 years, he could quickly increase the association's interest. The protagonist imagined the distrustful faces of the workers. Juno thought that, naturally, they wouldn't immediately listen to the words of a janitor. The protagonist imagined himself surrounded by his colleagues. The hunter thought he first needed to befriend those who would be on his team in the future and earn their trust. The hunter closed his eyes and frowned. Juno thought there were more than 10,000 hunters, and how could he get to know them? The protagonist imagined himself as a janitor surrounded by strangers. He thought that at this rate, he'd have to clean for the rest of his life. The protagonist slightly opened his eyes, looking to the side. The protagonist opened his mouth, waking the man up. The bus was moving along the road. Juno shouted that they had already passed the stop. The man asked him to be quieter. A purple glow emanated from the dungeon entrance. The protagonist asked the guys why there were only 2 of them, and where the others were. Sang-yeop looked at the protagonist with displeasure, his mouth slightly open. He asked Juno if he was the boss, noting that Juntae had gone to get the missing meds. Soyeon added that Kujang wouldn't come due to personal reasons. The protagonist looked at Sang-yeop with a serious face. He said that 10 minutes had already passed, asking Sang-yeop why he was only buying it now. Sang-yeop noted that 10 minutes had passed, asking why Juno had only arrived just now. Juno said he had missed his stop. Sang-yeop smiled broadly, showing his teeth. He handed the can to Juno, looking at him with a smile. The cleaner said he had bought coffee, and they could drink it while they waited. The protagonist looked at Sang-yeop, remembering their first meeting. He thought that compared to the first day, Sang-yeop's attitude toward him had become almost angelic, and it seemed like Sang-yeop hadn't expected him not to miss a single day of work for a week. The protagonist took a small step forward. He asked the guys what they were waiting for, since they could go in alone. Sang-yeok raised the coffee can to his mouth while Junwoo looked at him. The dark-haired one said they hadn't finished there yet. Junwoo asked what exactly. The guys were standing beside a glowing gate. The dark-haired one noted they were cleaning the dungeon, adding that it was still ongoing. The protagonist stared at the glowing gate. Junwoo thought he hadn't cleaned anything there yet, but it was a blue dungeon, medium level at most. A city was visible through the dungeon's opening. Junwoo thought it wasn't that hard, and that the hunters wouldn't exceed the cleanup time, not understanding why they were still digging around. Soyeon looked at the hunter disapprovingly, confused. Junwoo simply called them pathetic. The hunter looked sideways at the dungeon, pressing his lips together. He thought he couldn't go in there to help them, and that they would probably be out soon. That was a wrong assumption. The cat was sitting on the stairs, washing itself with its paw. The protagonist twisted his face in anger, baring his teeth. After 30 minutes, he was furious, glaring at the entrance with displeasure. He asked what kind of bastards were digging around there for so long and delaying them. Soyeon said they were already coming out. The blade of a sword rested on the ground. Exhausted hunters came out of the dungeon. The protagonist said it was obvious they were at most rank D, noting they were so downcast because of a blue dungeon. Soyeon stopped the furious protagonist. Junwoo asked why they even got paid. Soyeon told the hunter that they could hear him. Long black hair appeared from the dungeon entrance. The protagonist's eyes widened in surprise. He wondered who could be coming out of the dungeon. A beautiful girl with black hair appeared at the exit. The protagonist thought her face looked familiar. The girl looked ahead with a serious expression. Junwoo thought her long black hair and fair skin were Minju's features. The protagonist remembered how Minju had stood by his side. He thought that at some point she had been part of the team under his command. The protagonist looked at the girl who appeared surprised. He didn't understand what she was doing there. Minju looked ahead cautiously. The dark-haired girl walked toward the furious protagonist and tensed up. She asked him what business he had with her. Junwoo replied with slight irritation that he had no business. Immediately, he bared his teeth and became very angry. He didn't understand why he had run into her. The dark-haired girl walked toward the fence area. He brooded over how he might meet his former team. The protagonist understood she was an exception. Junwoo had been very angry in the past when Minju approached him. The dark-haired girl had hated him for no reason. Minju made a face and yelled at the hunter. He remembered when he suggested she leave due to an injury and she cursed him out. He held back and became irritated when she swore. She had no idea it was all for her own good. Now the protagonist was leaning against the wall as the dark-haired girl walked past him. He knew she was a proud girl with a high opinion of herself. However, he knew that didn't affect her skills. So Yin looked worried at the protagonist, who noticed her. She looked at him with apprehension. The girl asked if he knew the huntress. She realized he was watching her very intently. The guy looked up, saying he didn't know her. She just looked like a friend of his. So Yin slightly smiled, looking to the side. She noticed his displeased expression. So Yin laughed when the protagonist became very irritated by the situation. She thought the dark-haired girl was his ex-girlfriend. He bared his teeth when So Yin wouldn't stop laughing. He didn't understand what kind of nonsense she was saying. The brown-haired girl apologized and said it was a joke. Juntae asked from the side if everyone was gathered. Juntae approached his colleagues. Juntae asked what had happened while he was gone. The protagonist replied harshly that nothing had happened. Sang-yeop looked irritated at Junwoo. He made a sarcastic joke, saying Junwoo had just seen his ex-girlfriend. The protagonist told Sang-yeop to shut up. He glared fiercely at his colleagues and told them to get to work. They were transported to a blue dungeon in the shape of a building. It was literally a dungeon inside a building. A group of cleaners was in a destroyed room with the remains of monsters. Juntae asked the protagonist if he had read about that dungeon beforehand. The guy replied that he hadn't and only knew that the boss looked like a human. The brown-haired man carefully observed his colleagues, who were chatting animatedly among themselves. Last week, the guys constantly asked him about monsters because he knew so much about them. That sounded ridiculous to him, but it seemed like no one knew anything about him so far. It was an abandoned room with many remains and dried blood. One of the cleaners said that the dungeon was inside a building, so some of them might have missed some items. They knew they needed to thoroughly check all corners, especially under the stairs where blood tended to pool. The protagonist and Juntae walked forward with a worried look. Juntae asked the protagonist to go with him to the boss's lair. There was a huge multi-story ruined building. Juntae covered his face with his hand as Junwoo looked ahead under their bags. The cleaner's boss explained that he really didn't like humanoid monsters since their bodies looked too much like humans. The bloodied corpse of a girl was lying on the stairs. It was a Viga humanoid monster, a creature in the form of a girl around 160 centimeters tall. Junwoo observed as the cleaner bent over the corpse. The brown-haired man noted that they might not have cut the body but rather taken the whole body. Juntae agreed with the man's decision. The cleaner glanced back sharply. He didn't understand why the brown-haired man had frozen. The protagonist looked down, cautiously observing the corpse, avoiding asking questions. He knew something was wrong there. He recalled how Minju fought that Viga monster. In his memory, Viga wasn't such a dangerous monster, and if one were careful with its speed, it wouldn't be too hard to destroy. He wondered if there really was a tough battle between Minju and that monster. He remembered the image of the brunette skillfully holding her blue sword. He knew that 10 years ago, Minju was rank B, With that rank, hunters were considered quite strong. He remembered how the monster bared its teeth and was furious. If it hadn't been for the injury, the brunette could have easily reached rank S. Minju skillfully swung her sword in front of the monster. Her swordsmanship at the time was even higher than his. Blood splattered behind the brunette. She had a terrible personality, but she was very capable. Minju cautiously looked ahead while the monster hovered behind her. Juno knew she wasn't the type of person who would be ashamed of the Blue Dungeon's boss. Jotip pulled the monster's body as Juno watched. The cleaner asked the man again why he had frozen, not wanting to do all the work by himself. The protagonist answered that he was thinking for a moment. He looked closely at the Vigu's corpse. It didn't matter to him anymore, as he would never find her again anyway. He saw cuts on the monster's legs. The protagonist suddenly became perplexed, observing what was happening over the days. He noticed these cuts. Immediately, he became alarmed and began to formulate a hypothesis about what was happening. The sky was cloudless. The hero stood with his mouth agape, placing a hand over his mouth, thinking it was 5 a.m. and it seemed like he'd only slept for 2 hours, waking up on the wrong side of the bed for the 3rd day in a row. Looking at the backs of his companions, one of them glaring to the side, saying they could have called him at the inn and asking how much longer they would have to wait. The protagonist continued and thought that even when he was a hunter, he was never this busy. The middle-aged man looked at the angry one with a smile and said he didn't even know what to say because everything was as usual, suggesting they were just delayed and that at least they could think their colleagues were waiting. Jumi was furious, thinking that an hour had already passed, and then thought that it was no wonder the guy was so upset. But then a woman called him, and when he turned, she assumed he was very tired, to which he replied, yes, and asked if the blonde was okay. Her eyes were like those of a dead person, and she smiled, saying she was in excellent condition. The man with the scar on his nose looked at her with concern and remained silent, wondering if she was alright. Then he walked a little ahead and seriously told her that she should take breaks sometimes, to which she agreed worriedly, and the middle-aged man said they were finally leaving. The hunters stepped out of the portal, and the angry guy looked at one of them and said with displeasure that they were an hour and a half late. The man with green eyes saw something and cursed, saying it happened again. There was a girl with long hair, and he thought there were many dungeons and hunters, wondering why he was encountering her. They stood face to face and maintained a meaningful silence. The hero lowered his head and tried to pass, but she went in the same direction. Then she tried to go around him from the other side, and he went the same way. They glared at each other with hostility and maintained the meaningful silence. Then the girl stepped back, straightened her shoulders, and asked why he was in her way, while the protagonist, irritated, looked at her and asked who that unpleasant girl was. The dark-haired girl straightened her shoulders, massaging them. He remembered the bloody images of her. He looked at her softly and wondered whether he should tell her what he knew. Then the man with green eyes stepped away, frowning, thinking he wouldn't do that and questioning why he would. When he remembered that day, everything inside him flipped. In his former form, he entered the hospital room where the swordswoman was. She looked at him with a bit of concern and asked if it was him. The man with green eyes looked at her with furrowed brows and asked how she was, thinking about how she didn't even stand up in the presence of her boss. Then he crossed his arms and she, looking down with worry, said she had just had surgery, to which he clicked his tongue, saying she was a swordswoman but still didn't take care of her health. He showed with his hands that she needed to train her left hand more and that she had relied too much on her own strength, which naturally resulted in this. Then he said it was good to rest sometimes, to which she remained silent, thoughtful. The girl looked away from him and, frowning, asked why he hadn't told her that right away. The man with the scar on his nose asked irritably what that tone meant. The young man put his hands on his hips and said sternly that he was saying it because he cared. He took the envelope from his pocket and said that, to summarize, in her current state, she couldn't be a hunter anymore. The dark-haired man threw the paper on the bed, which shocked her, and said she should quit that job. She asked what he was talking about. While the paper lay on the bed, he said that the association thought the same way. The girl with yellow eyes looked at the envelope with alarm and lowered her head. The man with the scar on his nose, squinting his eyes, said that if she continued, she would have to give up not only her work as a hunter, but also a normal life. She interrupted him, saying he was wrong. The girl trembled with anxiety and stated she only had a mild injury, and he knew she should continue working there. The young man sat somewhere and asked what kind of nonsense she was saying, asserting that in her current state, she would only become a burden to the team. The decision had already been made, and she needed to accept it as a fact. He turned and asked why she needed to endure the pain, saying that she should have said this from the start. The girl with yellow eyes looked at him with furrowed brows and asked what he meant by should have said this from the start. The man with green eyes looked at her with disgust and said clearly that was exactly what he meant, asking if she hadn't realized that something was hurting her. The employee screamed in anger, saying she had already said that many times, and then affirmed she had already asked to be examined. Remembering how she had approached him with a problem on a rainy day, the dark-haired girl said that he had said everyone was in pain and that she should do her job. In his memory, the commander had said with disgust that she thought she was the sickest. The girl with yellow eyes looked at him with furrowed brows, letting a tear fall, and asked loudly who was responsible for her enduring all of this up to that point. Then she asked who had brought her to this state and said that now he was telling her to quit her job. The man with green eyes immediately leaned toward her anger in his eyes which startled her, and asked why all of this was his fault. His pupils narrowed considerably, and he asked if he had really ruined her shoulder, saying that she should take care of her health and not blame others. Then he asked what kind of idiot would continue working after hearing those words. The girl shrank back and said that anyway, she would be able to keep hunting and would just need to rest for a few days. The man crossed his arms, furrowed his brows, and asked who would work for her, and questioned what she could do with the shoulder in that state, mentioning that her job was to be a swordswoman, and if she wanted to stay there so badly, she should transfer to the cleaning department. But then his face changed, contorted, and she asked if he had ever considered her a colleague. He asked back, not understanding what she meant. The long-haired girl smiled sarcastically and apologized for the stupid question, saying that to him, she was just a tool that could be discarded after use. The protagonist leaned toward her angrily and asked if she had decided to confront him, saying that, to be honest, he had never liked her from the start. He then asked if she was ignoring her own boss and said he should have praised her a little, but now she didn't take him seriously. The girl with yellow eyes cried, lowered her gaze angrily, and said it was true, that she hated him because he didn't see those beneath him as people. The man with the scar on his nose looked at her with hatred, and she continued, saying that look had always been present in him. Then she listed the insults he used to say, stating that he could say whatever he wanted, but it didn't affect her anymore. The man took a strong slap to the face. The dark-haired girl glared at him with hatred and said she hoped that in the next life, he would be born a normal person, then insulted him. In the present, the hero recognized his own mistake, and with a blank expression, thought that, upon further analysis, she had said her arm hurt. Then the man with green eyes turned and thought that he didn't even remember that he had told her to ignore the details and continue with the work, and that he had said that without thinking. As he watched her walk away, he remembered the past and the injury, thinking that if it hadn't been for the injury, she would have accomplished so much, and he hadn't imagined that the disease was already developing. The man with black eyebrows looked ahead with concern and said that it bothered him. He turned to her, which confused her, and asked her to listen to him. She asked anxiously what he wanted. The hero began gesturing awkwardly and said that she needed to train her left hand more. The dark-haired woman stared at him, not understanding, and asked him to explain what he had just said. The protagonist gathered his thoughts and explained that when holding the sword, she was only stressing her right arm, which overloaded her shoulder. Then he demonstrated exactly the posture, imagining her behind him, saying that in that position the attack was faster, but the effort was excessive on one side only. He waved his hand as if holding a sword and said that it was necessary to use the left hand as well. That would reduce the load on the body, and the most important thing was balance. The girl with yellow eyes looked at him with furrowed brows and reluctantly agreed. The protagonist immediately became embarrassed and thought that she was basically saying that even this janitor understood the subject. Then he entered the portal, still dissatisfied, saying that she was a hunter and would know how to manage on her own, or else she should undergo an examination. The girl with long hair looked at him confused and asked what that meant. The sun shone brightly over the hospital building. The doctor with glasses crossed his arms with a smile and said that she had arrived just in time. The girl anxiously asked what he meant. The specialist handed her an x-ray and explained that there was mild inflammation in her right shoulder. Nothing serious for now, but if left untreated, it could lead to major complications. He then crossed his arms below his chest and said that he would first prescribe anti-inflammatories, and the most important thing was to change her posture. The girl asked exactly how she should do that. She remembered with concern the janitor who had said she needed to train her left hand, and the doctor explained that at the moment the strength was being distributed unevenly in her body and concluded that she needed to train her left hand more. The girl realized and thought that the strange janitor had said exactly the same thing. Birds were flying over the stadium. The hero exited the portal as if he were dead, saying that he was about to die, and the middle-aged man laughed, saying that everyone had worked hard. Then a colleague approached the protagonist and asked if he wasn't exaggerating, to which he replied by asking what more was needed, saying that he was exhausted. A swordswoman was watching from a distance, and the colleague continued asking how he could leave his ex-girlfriend waiting for so long. She watched closely, and he was surprised, wondering what she was doing there. The hero remained confused, while the colleagues behind him commented on the situation. At this moment, he was still trying to understand why she was there. The man with dark hair reminded him that he had already said she was his ex, and the middle-aged man suggested they leave. The girl, visibly tired, confirmed, saying that was indeed true. The colleagues began to leave, and the older man said they would see each other the next day, while the man with dark hair muttered with disdain that someone was lucky. At that moment, the janitor cursed in his mind. Then he crossed his arms, looked forward, and asked what had happened, saying he was very tired and needed to hurry before the buses were gone. The huntress placed the sword on his neck. Soon after, she stared at him firmly and asked how he knew about that and who he really was. The man with green eyes became furious, gritted his teeth, and wondered if she was really pointing a sword at him. The girl kept the blade raised while he remained with his hands on his waist. She asked why he was silent and how he knew about that. He asked what she was talking about, then she continued, saying she was referring to the shoulder, and questioned if he was pretending not to know anything. The man with the scar on his nose stared at her calmly and thought it seemed like she had really done an exam, saying that he had only said that impulsively. She stood still, and he said he only wanted to show off in front of a huntress and ended up repeating something he read on the internet. The girl asked if that was true, if he had really read that on the internet. The hero froze, remembering the posture he had shown. The swordswoman then stated that the technique she used was confidential information, impossible to disclose, but he had precisely identified the muscles and positions used. He lowered his head, anxious, thinking he had said too much, and was now under suspicion, and admitted that it made sense, since she used a special technique. The girl kept staring at him, and he thought anxiously that a simple janitor couldn't know something like this, and she could report him to the association, accusing him of espionage. He sighed and with his head down said that he had seen sword marks on the monster's body. She repeated, surprised. He raised his eyes and explained that among all the cuts, something caught his attention. He remembered the creature's carcass and said that the injuries made with the right hand were deep, while the others were more superficial, and that was how he realized the lack of strength in her left side. He then became more serious, remembering the dead boss, and said that Vega was a boss known for his attack speed, without offering other threats. The man visualized the battle and commented on a famous attack that used reverse speed, but said he didn't find any traces of that technique, and he didn't believe a huntress as talented as her wouldn't know about something like that. The girl anxiously recalled how she received the blow, and he concluded that she didn't react to Vega's attack because she was physically incapable. The swordswoman lowered the blade from his neck and said that at some point she had felt tension in her shoulder. The protagonist then pointed at her and stated that in normal life, this was almost imperceptible, but in situations requiring quick reactions, it became obvious, especially for her being a swordswoman. He then thought of his former self and realized that the reason he knew all of this, even though he wasn't a swordsman, was simple. When he was a hunter, he had all the classes. The girl with long hair lowered her head calmly and said that he still was, then placed her hand on his shoulder with a serene face and asked with a smile if that janitor was a free hunter. The hero was stunned to hear that and wanted to ask what kind of nonsense she was saying, but was interrupted when she mentioned hearing about several of them in the capital. The girl with bright eyes then imagined various warriors and mentioned Freya-level hunters, calling them masters who did not reveal their identity to anyone, even though they were high-ranking or high-level hunters belonging to private guilds. The protagonist removed her hand from himself and asked again what absurdity that was, stating that he wasn't a hunter. She retorted, asking who then he was. Calmly, the man with green eyes scratched his ear and replied that he was just a janitor. Then he began to move away and with his eyes closed, asked if she would be satisfied with that answer, saying that he needed to work the next day and was leaving. The hero lowered his head and thought it was clear what she wanted, and that if he were indeed a successful hunter, she would try to use him for her own purposes. The man with the scar on his nose moved away, thinking that now he was just a dungeon cleaner, that they would hardly see each other again. But then she called him from behind and thanked him. He turned around and asked again, surprised. His eyes showed concern, and Junwoo reflected on what she had said, questioning whether she had really thanked him. The girl with dark hair became embarrassed, scratched her cheek, and apologized again, saying that if he didn't mind. Meanwhile, a question about vacation could be heard from one of the various offices on several floors. The swordswoman was before the boss, who crossed his arms and said that was true, and that the support department had recommended she rest. He asked if this was because of the exam, and she confirmed. The boss drummed his fingers on the table and asked if she was taking vacation just because her shoulder was a little sore. The man with silver hair looked at her and said that when he was a hunter, she couldn't even imagine something like that. He sat up straight, and she explained that she wanted to improve her skills, to which he replied that it was nonsense and asked if she was planning to travel with some guy. She denied it. She glared at him, furrowing her brows, and he wanted to know what she planned to do then. She replied that she wanted to learn sword techniques. The boss with light-colored hair tilted his head and asked if she had signed up for any course, and she said they would be individual lessons. The boss then questioned what kind of lessons those would be, asking if it would be with a mirror master or if she would study with some man. The girl with yellow eyes looked away, irritated, and replied that it was a janitor. The boss became indignant right away, and she added that he was a janitor from the dungeon cleaning department. The man with gray eyes looked at her reproachfully and asked if there was really no one else, and if that's why she chose a janitor as a teacher. Then he said that being a huntress, it would be better to look for courses. The girl retorted, irritated, saying she would handle it herself. Soo-young asked if it was the same janitor who advised her to check her shoulder, and she became agitated, thinking how he knew about it, assuming that the support department had told him. The girl with dark hair remembered when she passed by the hospital, and the receptionist smiled, saying that she had been coming often and asking what happened. The girl with yellow eyes tried to explain quickly, and Minju looked away, thinking that was why. The boss then pointed at her and said that guy wasn't simple at all, and asked if he had decided to train a huntress. The girl looked away and with her eyes closed, said that he still hadn't agreed to teach her, explaining that she had asked, but he refused. The boss frowned and asked loudly if that was a joke, questioning how she would study with someone who hadn't even agreed. The girl with dark hair closed her eyes firmly and said she would insist until he accepted. The man took his hand to his head, covering one of his eyes, and told her to figure it out on her own, reminding her that in a few days there would be a major expedition and she should return before everything started. Minju bowed and thanked him, and he began to wave his hand, telling her to leave and go already. She left through the door. The man with silver hair gritted his teeth and said that all of this was just a joke, asking what she could learn from a simple janitor. Sun Young intertwined his fingers, furrowed his brows, and reflected on what would happen if the other teams found out, especially if the information reached the leader of the second team. He then became even more tense when mentioning the cleaning department. The boss reached for the phone, saying that just thinking about it made him feel bad. The man with silver hair stared ahead, introduced himself, and asked if the director was available. The voice on the other end confirmed that he was there. They asked what had happened, and the boss demanded to be connected immediately, saying he needed to inform something important. A few days later, the gates opened. A man with a respirator was standing, and someone could be heard humming a song. The protagonist's colleague with dark hair twirled his finger on his temple while working and commented that the hero had finally gotten into the rhythm. Juno continued with his tasks when a notification appeared above his head, informing him that the association's interest in the cleaning department had increased. A skill had been unlocked. He thought he hadn't done anything for this and wondered why, but soon concluded that it didn't matter. The most important thing was to reach the capital. A man in his mid-30s approached with a concerned expression and asked if everything was okay. A guy in his 30s commented that he didn't want to get involved in his personal life. Then he pointed to the swordswoman who was cleaning and wanted to know what she was doing there. The protagonist, calm, replied that he had brought her himself. The other shouted, of course, it could only have been the protagonist. Juno imagined his colleague and thought that since they didn't know when he would return, extra help would be useful. The girl with dark hair was diligently scrubbing the floor with a cloth, while the middle-aged man commented that she was a huntress, and that if the association found out she was cleaning. While trying to argue with the hero, he thought that he had brought her there because he wanted to. The swordswoman knelt before the janitor and asked him to teach her sword techniques. He was surprised and thought that she must have eaten something strange, wondering what kind of huntress would ask a janitor to teach her combat techniques. Soon after, he realized that she would continue insisting and concluded that he needed to think of something to make her give up. He crossed his arms, smiled, and looked away, saying that if she helped him with the cleaning, he would consider it. He thought that a rank B huntress would never agree to clean. However, she quickly became impatient and asked if helping with the cleaning was all it took, and he realized that his plan had failed. Scratching his head while watching her clean, he thought that he had underestimated her, because he believed she was too proud for this. The girl, exhausted, kept cleaning without stopping, and he questioned how things had come to this point. He watched calmly but soon became irritated, gritting his teeth, thinking about how she had always been so stubborn. The girl with red eyes silently observed everything attentively. At that moment, she watched as if she were behind the scenes of a romantic drama, and in her mind, Minju lowered her head. The protagonist looked at her with tender eyes. She furrowed her brows, distressed by the situation. Junwoo touched his nose with his finger and thought that he had underestimated the swordswoman, never imagining she would follow him all the way there. It was when the girl with long hair raised her hand and called him teacher, saying that she couldn't remove his stain. Irritated, he asked her not to call him that. He approached, pointed his finger, and asked what she thought, and if she thought it was possible to remove the stain by just scrubbing hard, to which she replied that she didn't know. There were bloodstains on the floor. He continued explaining, saying that the blood was human, the other was from a monster, and that it probably wouldn't be possible to erase the mixed blood. First, it was necessary to remove the human blood and then melt the rest with fire. The girl with yellow eyes was standing behind him when he drew a dagger, and upon hearing that she would obey, he explained that the burned piece was monster meat. He began to slide the blade across the floor, saying that it would take time, but it was necessary to carefully scrape the meat with the dagger so it could be used as medicine in the future. He then placed the separated pieces aside and instructed them to be stacked in that way. After that, he cleaned the blade while everything behind him was perfectly clean, commenting that it was necessary to sanitize the knife before each use as the monster's blood could corrode it. The girl with yellow eyes observed with concern and agreed. He then looked at her with satisfaction and asked what was with her expression, teasing her if she really wanted to get involved in this, stating that it was undignified work for a huntress, believing she would give up. However, she placed her hand on her chin and said it was a very important occupation, which made him wonder what was wrong with her. The middle-aged man approached and embarrassed the protagonist by stating that now he had also registered as a janitor. Smiling, he asked what the reason for such praise was. Junwoo was speechless. He remembered battles against hordes of monsters, thought about how he had been looked down upon before, and now couldn't understand how he could be praised for cleaning, being an SS-ranked hunter. He immediately became frustrated and cursed mentally. The exhausted girl watched as they conversed and praised each other. Once again, she thought it seemed like a scene from a romantic drama, where they continued to flatter each other. The girl with red eyes watched everything anxiously, maintaining a significant silence. Ashes flew through the cave. The girls were nearby, and the exhausted one commented that they needed to help on the other side. The second girl turned to the teacher, saying that she had finished and asked what she should do next. The middle-aged man pointed to the large amount of bodies in the area, and she replied that she might not have another chance to work alongside a hunter. They approached the gate and promised to return soon. The two young men watched them in silence until the dark-haired one commented that he bet the huntress would do everything alone. The other agreed without hesitation. Dark smoke came out of the building's walls and someone was reflecting on what to do. The exhausted girl intertwined her fingers, embarrassed, thinking that she had dragged the other there and now didn't know what to say. She stared at the path ahead with apprehension, questioning why she couldn't just act and why she was so worried. The swordswoman approached and asked if she was okay, saying that she looked tired. The girl replied that she would hold on. Looking closely at the huntress, she said that she didn't look okay at all. They continued down the corridor and the girl with red eyes confessed that in reality, she hadn't been sleeping well for days. They asked why, but she said it was nothing special. She then smiled with her eyes closed and asked why everyone kept insisting on talking about her, suggesting that the other should share something about herself, since it was the first time they were speaking personally with the huntress. The girl with yellow eyes looked down and said there wasn't much to tell, and that just like her father, she had become a huntress. The exhausted girl clapped her hands, surprised to learn that her father was also a hunter, and asked if they worked together. She replied that her father had been dismissed due to a shoulder injury. Imagining a conversation between her father and his boss, she told them that her superiors always told him not to get involved in others' business and just do his duty. Remembering when he left his colleagues, she commented that they always looked at him with suspicion and that he tried so hard, afraid of being expelled, until he eventually got injured. The dark-haired girl frowned, saying that couldn't be true, to which the other replied that although they were colleagues, it wasn't really like that. Her father looked at the ground, protecting her with his back, while she said that in the association, there were no colleagues, only superiors or subordinates in rank. Her father had been a rank B hunter before being dismissed. She remembered when she would look at him with sadness, wondering if anyone would care about a dead rank B hunter. Then she thought of his back and said that he was just a disposable weapon. After that, she lowered her gaze and stated that this was the reality of the association, where hierarchy determined everything. The weak were infinitely strong, and the strong were infinitely weak. Looking ahead, the girl with yellow eyes commented that other hunters thought the same way, but then she silently wondered about the janitors. She fell silent when she spotted a massive gate in front of them. Soon after, the huntress cleared her throat, surprising the girl with red eyes, and asked if she was interested in the teacher. The girl blushed immediately and asked if it was that obvious. The dark-haired girl looked at her and confirmed that it was. Soyeon became embarrassed and said that she only. Then she remembered the moments with the protagonist saying that he did his job well and was responsible. Although he had been lazy on the first day and arrived late on the second, until recently, she had wanted to give up, but now she felt as if she had gained a second wind. The other girl clenched her fists as Soyeon continued, saying that he also dealt with monsters quickly in the dungeons, provided more accurate data than the management team, and knew things that weren't even in the database. The girl with yellow eyes stared into space, furrowing her brow, imagining her teacher. She thought that he really wasn't someone ordinary, remembering when he determined the cause of death and the perpetrator of a crime just by knife wounds and understanding monsters and dungeons better than anyone else. She grew more serious, thinking that in this case, she needed to cling to him even more. The girl with long hair averted her gaze, thinking that in any case, she didn't need to worry, as she had no interest in him. The girl with red eyes, anxious, said that she understood and asked why she then sought him out every day. She clenched her fists, looked ahead, and replied that, as she had already said, the association was weak in front of the strong and strong against the weak, and she couldn't accept that. Clenching her fist even tighter, she stated that this was why she needed to become stronger, and for that, she needed the teacher's help. The girl with red eyes observed her and asked if that meant, then smiled and asked if she would be his future girlfriend. The girls laughed and the one with long hair snapped her fingers, asking why they needed him and if they couldn't solve things on their own, also questioning why they needed a leader like him. The other girl agreed and the protagonist wondered when they had become so close. In front of the gate, he said he was repeating himself and warned about a poisonous monster ahead. He assured them that they would be able to handle it, but they needed to be careful. The middle-aged man raised his finger, looked seriously at everyone, and said that as long as the poison didn't come into contact with their skin, there would be no danger. The team members agreed. He then turned to Soyeon. She became excited and responded. He asked what had happened to her and why she was so slow that day. Fiddling with her clothes, she explained that the uniform was uncomfortable and that it was hard to breathe with the gas mask on. Anxiously, she said she didn't think it would interfere with the work. The dark-haired man, irritated, asked if it wasn't time to change the equipment and demanded that the association increase the budget, saying that situations like this could lead to tragedies. The older man looked at him and asked why they were listening to that, stating that there was no budget and nothing they could do. The other, concerned, replied that it wasn't a good idea to keep saving money and allowing workers to die. Then the boss leaned against the gate and told everyone to stop talking and start working, also demanding that the equipment not be damaged. The door began to open slowly. Inside, they found a huge puddle of slime. The middle-aged man watched it with concern, stating that they couldn't let it touch their skin. The protagonist thought that the boss monster was a super slime, although it appeared to be a regular slime. There were many monster corpses on the floor, and he concluded that the lethal poison or prolonged exposure to the smell could cause poisoning, Since about 5 minutes had passed, he believed there was no more risk. June looked at the corpse of a goblin and reflected that he still needed to be much more careful. A greenish mist began to form under the ceiling. The janitors started collecting the slime, and the boss asked if everything was alright. They confirmed. Then he asked how the huntress was feeling, and she replied that she was fine. The leader approached Soyeon and asked how she was, but she remained silent. He touched her shoulder and repeated the question. Shortly after, she fell dead. She hit her head, and everyone screamed her name, alarmed. The man held her as she trembled and asked what had happened. Her face was pale, and someone exclaimed that something was wrong as she tried to breathe. The dark-haired boy, frightened, said that the cleaning agent had probably not worked and that the slime had corroded the protective suit. The leader ordered them to leave immediately and to call the support service urgently. The protagonist watched everything and blamed himself for not paying enough attention during the preparation, which led to this situation. From outside, calls for help were directed at him. He looked at the girl and concluded that it was too late, as the support team wouldn't make it in 5 minutes to administer the antidote. The hero saw the middle-aged man beside the victim, while the dark-haired boy stared at him, thinking that besides that, the poison from the slime caused unbearable pain as it invaded the body until it completely destroyed it. Sang-hyuk asked him not to stand still and do something. Another person said that help would be here soon. The protagonist lowered his head and turned to Minju, who said she was listening. The girl was scared and he said he needed a sword. She asked what he planned to do. The protagonist fell silent, observing his worried colleagues. The oldest one wanted to know what he was planning, saying it wasn't Soyeon's fault and asking him to stop. But Junwoo Kim's eyes were full of determination and he asked for haste as time was running out. Seriously, the protagonist said that it wouldn't be difficult, just a single strike. The girl with yellow eyes looked at him in horror, pleading for him not to do it, saying that there were other ways if only he would think. The boy with green eyes answered calmly, asking what the victim had to do with it, and said he needed to cut her. The older man warned that the girl was already in critical condition, to which the protagonist replied that precisely because of that, he should be quiet and asked the huntress to act quickly. She stared at him in surprise and closed her eyes and nodded. Then she moved her hand to the side, saying that she had no idea what he was planning. She used an invocation and a blade appeared in her hand. She then activated a skill, making the sword shine. The boy with green eyes was immediately startled and demanded that she stop, saying he hadn't told her to activate the skill. She struck him with a blow. Junwoo Kim gritted his teeth, bleeding, and with furrowed brows, he thought that she needed to learn how to listen. Blood was dripping from his body, and a notification indicated that an attack against the conjurer had been detected. He pressed the wound tightly, and another notification stated that a combat stance had been activated. He thought that it hurt a lot. Turning around, he glared at the girl and said he would take her to the support team and that they would meet there. The middle-aged man looked at him worried and asked what he was talking about, mentioning the injury and reminding him that even by taxi, it would take 30 minutes to get there. But at that moment, the victim was taken directly in front of them, a spark crossing the door. The poisoned girl was on his back. Junwoo Kim ran down the corridor using his super acceleration skill. With furrowed brows and sweat dripping from his forehead, he thought that he needed to go even faster, as only 3 minutes were left. The hospital rose under the night sky. The elderly man watched with tears in his eyes and expressed his thanks. The doctor was in front of him and he bowed. The specialist said they arrived in time and that the injury was quite dangerous, but he believed she would recover soon. The leader expressed his immense gratitude. The man with glasses seemed worried and turned to the boy. The hero stood up and said his name. The doctor was about to leave, which irritated Junwoo Kim, who reminded him to pay for the stitches before leaving, thinking that the damn man was also paid for a few stitches. The tired girl became concerned and smiled, laughing. The team looked at her seriously. They all surrounded her, and the dark-haired man asked if she understood how much they had been scared, telling her to immediately notify them if she felt strange. The victim apologized. He became a bit more aggressive and asked what was going on, cursing while questioning why the equipment and protection were torn and broken. The oldest one said they were in the hospital and needed to calm down, avoiding insults. The dark-haired man looked down and asked how they could avoid insults if they didn't change the protective suits at least once every 6 months. He stated that if he were a hunter, he would just complain a little, and they would immediately change the equipment. The elder then said that these people— The angry man crossed his arms and looked at the girl with yellow eyes, asking if he was right. She significantly remained silent. Then he turned, embarrassed, saying that it wasn't about the hunters, and she confirmed that everything was fine. The older man looked at the poisoned girl and said he would write her a leave of absence, since it was a work accident and she should take this opportunity to rest. She asked, surprised, if the boss would really do that. He confirmed, saying that of course he would, since the girl was seriously injured at work. The girl with red eyes got up from the bed and asked where he was going. He calmly replied that he wanted some time outdoors. When he stepped to the door and walked down the corridor, he thought that the accident had happened because of the old equipment. Then the boy smiled, and after a meaningful pause, said that he hoped this would lead to more. The man with green eyes walked down the corridor with his head lowered, and a notification appeared, indicating that the conditions to lift the ban were an increase in the dungeon cleaning team's budget. He thought that it was time to increase the budget. His eyes became predatory, and the hero thought that if there was a risk of getting into trouble or getting hurt because of old equipment, the association would have no choice but to allocate funds to maintain its image. He concluded that as soon as the ban was lifted, he would already have 2 skills, and at this pace, he wouldn't stay in the cleaners category for much longer. The girl with red eyes looked down, saddened, and commented on the expression on his face, asking if something was wrong. The elder said that he was just irritated. She looked down, concerned, thinking about what had made him upset. The older man sighed and looked at her seriously, saying that the reason was completely different. She was surprised, and he continued, saying that it all came down to her injury. The dark-skinned man smiled and said that although he seemed temperamental, he really cared about his colleagues, something that was clear when you watched him. The girl looked ahead and remembered how he had run, thinking that he was willing to give his life to save his colleagues, and he was also the person she still had a lot to learn from. The dark-haired man looked up, confused, and commented that the more he watched him, the stranger he seemed. She then asked what the reason for that was. Then they stared at each other with concern, and the boy mentioned that she didn't remember anything, but the hero had saved her life using skills. She immediately asked loudly, and the man with dark eyes continued, saying that it was true. He hadn't been working for long, but a cleaner using skills was something crazy. The girl looked down, concerned, and asked if he had really saved her, saying that she hadn't even thanked him. The elder looked at the huntress and asked what she thought of this. She placed her hand under her chin, furrowing her brows, and asked if he was referring to the teacher. She replied that she didn't know, but she thought he seemed good, though he wasn't her type. The man looked at her, confused, and the elder explained that he wasn't referring to that, and asked what she thought about his skills as a hunter. The girl placed her hand under her chin, feeling immediately embarrassed. She understood what they meant and thought that this was very embarrassing. The elder looked at her and said that frankly, with skills like his, he was wasting himself working as a cleaner. Besides, he knew more about monsters than most hunters. The girl with dark hair looked at him and asked what he thought about relocating the employees. He replied that of course it would be possible, but very difficult, although it was a good opportunity for Juno. She placed her hand under her chin, furrowing her brows, and said that the hero really surpassed other hunters in skills and experience. But the problem was that the others looked at her surprised as she continued, saying that the problem was that he was in the cleaning team. The man with dark hair pointed at her and became irritated, asking if it was true that he couldn't rise in the hierarchy as a cleaner. She replied that it was actually the opposite. The man calmed down and made an inquisitive sound. She looked down and introduced the protagonist, saying that even though she was a B-class hunter, she couldn't assess the teacher. She then said that he was the only one who knew his own strength and asked why he had joined the cleaning team and what that could mean. The elder looked at her with a questioning expression and asked what she meant. She crossed her arms and replied that she couldn't think of anything more about it. The older man asked why he would need this dirty job. The girl with long hair, calm, said that she had some theories. Her eyes sparkled with impatience as she said that the teacher probably had excellent skills but didn't want to get involved in the association's affairs, especially not in the hierarchy of the hunters. He chose the cleaning team to feel the unity of the team. The dark-haired man looked at her embarrassed upon hearing the word cohesion. The elder also focused on the word team. The woman with red eyes looked surprised. The team immediately became embarrassed and looked away. The older man said that if that was really the case, it would be better not to talk about it anymore, as there was nothing they could do about it. The hot-tempered guy commented that the guy had always had this opinion about them, and then calmly said that the guy definitely had a sense of loyalty. The injured girl named the protagonist. The guy looked at them, furrowing his brows, and said that something occurred to him. If he had this opinion about them, he wouldn't have joined the association because of the incident with Soyeon. The girl with yellow eyes looked ahead, surprised, thinking if he would really be that kind of person. The hero stood in front of the dark-haired man, looking at him with serious eyes. The director of the Korean branch of the association looked at him the same way and asked who he was. The man said he was from the cleaning team. Hey everyone, did you enjoy this story? I really liked it. If you want to follow the next part, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. See you in the next story, guys.